So this has to be one of the most frustrating build reworks that I've ever done in any game, simply because of how many pieces were required to make it work. But we are finally here, and just like my Rapier and Ice Gauntlet rework, the build is feeling the best that it has ever felt. And I am very excited to share with you all today. But before we get into the changes that I've made, the thing I want to talk about first is what the build is based around now, which is guard points. Now, I'm sure some of my off-meta strength bros probably already know how absolutely insane guard point is, but just in case you're unaware, um, guard point, all it really does is while I am in defensive stance, anytime I'm charging up a heavy, I am also able to block attacks. So as you can see with that little blue energy in front of me there, if I receive an attack in that little time frame while I'm charging up a heavy, it'll block an attack. Now, why is that such a good thing, or why is that so strong? As we know, blocking is a pretty powerful, or can be a pretty powerful tool. You are reducing the damage from the attack that you block, and in a melee weapons case, you are reducing all of the damage from that attack if you block it. On top of that, if the attack that you block has any negative effects, so let's say I block a leaping strike, or I block a shield bash, or I block a void scream, I won't get CC'd by any of those things. So I won't get staggered by that leaping strike if I block it, or I won't get stunned by the shield bash if I block that. Now, as good as blocking is in general, like in any game or any situation, you can't really just block forever because you are unable to be offensive while you are being defensive. And that is why guard point is such a powerful tool, because it allows you to be on the offensive, or at least queue up an offensive action or combo or plan while being in that defensive state of having guard point up. But it doesn't just stop there. On top of that, on top of the fact that I'm able to charge a heavy attack while I'm blocking, the stamina damage that I take for blocking with guard points is reduced by 50%. So any attack that I take is going to do less stamina damage to me, on top of Great Sword's already pretty decent blocking stability. But on top of that, it also rends any attack or any attacker that I block with guard points. But it doesn't stop there. Guard point is actually better than a regular block. So you can block almost any CC in the game with like a regular block. So I can almost block anything, but there are certain things that get through regular blocks, such as Volt Kick or Shockwave from Hammer. For whatever reason, the way they coded it into the game, those are two CCs that you just can't block. If you try to block a Shockwave, you will get stunned. If you try to block a Volt Kick, it'll just break your guard. But guard point actually just blocks everything in the game. So you have reduced stamina damage while you're blocking. It afflicts rend. I can block anything with it because it's better than a regular block. I can charge up a heavy attack while I'm blocking with this better block. And then on top of all of that, you actually have a lot of options from this state of charging up a heavy. As you would assume, you might think it would leave you vulnerable because let's say I'm trying to fight somebody who's using guard point. I can just time my attack for when their guard point is going to end and then still hit them. But what you can do with guard point is you can cancel the animation into quite a few different options. So I can either cancel that heavy into a block and just keep blocking. If I see that they've timed their attack for my guard point, I can cancel that heavy into a roll. I can cancel that heavy just into a straight up ability. So any one of my three abilities. I can cancel that heavy into a weapon swap into my rapier and then just switch to an explosive burst from that slow and defensive state. So not only is it such a powerful defensive tool, but because of the options you have From that state of charging up the heavy, it allows you quite a few mix-up options on your opponent, which keeps them on their feet and keeps you less predictable. So yeah, that's why guard point has always been super strong, but with the place that the time to kill used to be at prior to the changes of this patch, and with how good that charged heavy in the onslaught stance used to be, it didn't make any sense to pour any time or effort into the defiant stance of the tree, because I could just go offensive stance and then just bash you with heavies all day. But they've nerfed the heavies, they've nerfed fortify, everybody's doing a lot more damage, so a lot of these things now are in a different place and have different effectiveness than they used to before. Now, with all that being said, there are two very important things that I would say come with guard points and this build and this playstyle. Guard point is a very particular playstyle, and it's going to take quite a bit of time to get used to. And on top of that, if you actually take a look at my stamina, it doesn't stop, but while I'm charging up my heavy, as you can see there, my stamina will actually slow down quite a bit. So you really need to get a handle of managing when you're guard pointing, when you're not, when you're charging up that heavy, when you're switching, when you're rolling. Just like PvP already is now, there's an extra layer that comes with it when using guard point, because as strong as guard point can be, it can also be the thing that gets you killed, because you can just run yourself out of stamina. So I'll definitely say, if you just pick up the build and you haven't run guard point at all, it's definitely going to be a bit of time, a bit of a learning period to get used to it. But as we're going to see in some of these clips, it is, as I mentioned, one of the most busted abilities in the game. So yeah, that is what the build is based on, but let's take a look at the changes that I've made. So in addition to switching from the playstyle that we had previously to this more guard point heavy style or playstyle, I've also gone back to one of the ideas I had for this build originally, which I tried to do, which was go for a bleed setup kind of build. And when I say bleed isn't our main source of damage. It's just a very consistent form of pressure. As we're gonna see in some of these fights, we can keep bleeds up on people for essentially the entire time we're fighting them. Given some builds, like some ranger builds and stuff like that, most characters or most builds that we find in the game, we will be able to keep a 100% uptime on some form of a dot. And one of those big changes was the rapier. So we made a change over to the putrid fishbone, which has keenly jagged on it. On our rapier, we're also running Tondo again. But on top of those things, I've also switched over to dot gems in both of my weapons. So we are running a void dot gem in our rapier. We are still running parry, the same great sword that we have been running on this build, which is probably one of the best great swords for it. But I have switched out the gem, so we are running the element that you go for. Really doesn't matter as long as it's not fire, because fire is going to be the weakest elemental gem to go for now. But pretty much anything else with that dot gem is going to really play into the build. And once again, once we start to see some of these clips, you'll see what I mean by the pressure that the dots are providing for us on this build. But looking at the gear, as I mentioned, one of the most frustrating parts about it was getting the gear together for this build. I've gone through, I can't tell you how many iterations of gear, pieces, gems, gold, rune glass gems, everything, to finally end up where we're at now. But one of the most annoying parts was the fact that I wanted to go for freedom. And prior to this patch, freedom used to be, for most players in the game, almost unattainable to get a full line of best in slot pieces with freedom, just because of how expensive they were. But with the changes that we got to this patch, and now that we have best in slot pieces dropping from the PvP track, it allows a lot more builds to be much more reasonably attained now that you can just grind it from the PvP track instead of spending 250,000 gold on a single piece. So yeah, it's going to be a 5 freedom setup, and then we're also running a couple of pieces of Shirking Fort, but on our boots, we are running Freedom, Shirking Fort, and Resilient. I picked up this piece actually a little while ago, but a also disgusting piece of pants here, Freedom, Shirking Fort, and Shirking Energy. On our gloves, I haven't been able to find a Freedom, Shirking Fort, and Omnidirectional Evade, or even a Freedom, Omni, and Resilient piece yet. And this was the most frustrating part, was trying to get 5 freedom pieces, trying to get as many Shirking Fort pieces on top of that as I could, still maintaining the resilient pieces that we needed, still maintaining omnidirectional evade, and then getting our stats all together. So that's what kind of made it annoying. But on our gloves, we don't have resilience, but we are still running freedom and that really, really important omnidirectional evade perk. Freedom resilient on our chest piece, and then freedom resilient, and then whatever else you can get on the headwear. I've also removed all of my rune glass gems, as you can tell, just to get my defenses a little bit higher, given that the time to kill is a lot shorter than it used to be. But taking a look at my jewelry here, we are running a fortified health and thrust protection amulet with a slash damage gem, and I'll go into the gems in a little bit, but fortified is a really, really strong perk on this build, and this is the reason why I wanted to go for Shirking Fort, because we have quite a few sources of fortify with the great sword when running it with Shirking Fort. We have a couple of sources from the great sword itself, and then Shirking Fort as well, and it actually is a pretty noticeable amount. It turns Shirking Fort into a 7-second duration, so it is actually pretty valuable. And then dust protection because bows, but we are running Champion's Ring still because we do use quite a few abilities on this build, and then Nimble and Refreshing Toast on the earring with that fire gem. Now, as you can see by my gems, we're running a mixture of opals and onyx in our gear, and as I mentioned, that slash damage, dust protection on our amulet, and then the fire. And I wanted to end up at a defensive split somewhat similar to this. As we know, the strongest things in the game right now are slash, thrust, and fire damage. Great sword, assassin builds, bows, muskets, spears, and then obviously fire staff, since the buff, have been obviously the most popular forms of damage. So it's what I wanted to try to build towards, and then still maintain a decent amount for my other resistances. The only thing that we had to kind of go a little bit low on was strike. So you do need to watch out for that hammer. It is the one thing that I felt okay with going low on because of just how slow hammer is, and it's relatively easy to dodge. But the off chance that you do get run up on that by the light armor hammer assassin, you might get bopped. But for the most part, I feel like we have a pretty nice spread here for our defensive stats. On the heart rune, we are running stone form, of course, still, and then yeah, that's what we are running for the gear now. So yeah, I'll just say right now, good luck on the pieces, unless you already have a couple that you've been saving up. But this is a very, very PvP track heavy build. Champion's Ring, all these freedom pieces, and then also the 2 weapons that you have to grind. Putrid Fishbone is actually pretty easy to grind, as the boss is just a random open world boss, but parry does drop from a dungeon. So that's the only thing that makes this build a little bit annoying, is trying to get all of this together for it. But as we're gonna see, it does make a difference. Now, taking a look at the attributes, I have moved 50 strength over to Constitution, being that, you know, we have that fortify change recently, the time to kill, fire staff, bows. I really felt like that the 200 Constitution really, really, really benefits the build now, and allows us to just actually stay there and brawl and actually utilize guard point. Because running at 150 con with this build, I've noticed that you can still be defensive with guard point, but if you make a single mistake and take a hit, then you pretty much have to disengage and heal. But with 200 con, not only do we have enough health to just soak up a little bit more damage, but that 200 con passive actually goes into our build pretty well, because we're getting more of an increase to our armor. So with us already sitting at 870 for physical and 800 for our elemental, when we get Shirking Fort, we go up to almost 1,000 physical and elemental resistances. So we're getting pretty close. We're not there yet, but we're getting close to medium armor mitigation levels in this build. And once you have Shirking Fort and a defensive buff up from your greatsword, you're gonna see that you are able to mitigate more damage than you're able to do normally on a light build. So now more than ever, I feel like 200 con is a very, very, very strong passive and amount to have for this build right now. But taking a look at the weapons and the setups for them, I wanted to make this build a little bit more open-ended than before. So I'm going to show you guys what the build looks like and the idea behind the bleed setup and what it does for the build. But if bleed isn't your thing, if you don't like Tondo, you can switch out Tondo, the rapier that I'm using, and Steadfast Strike for whatever else you want to use. The core of the build is based around guard point. So I wanted to at least build a good base to where you can then slot in whatever playstyle you enjoy yourself. So I would say Relentless Rush and Calamity Counter are probably pretty needed for the build, and then same thing goes for Evade and Flesh. But then you can definitely work around and take a look at Tondo and Steadfast Strike to slot those abilities to what you want. But what I'm running for my build right now is the traditional Grace setup minus Riposte with with Swiftness, Red Curtains, and Controlled Breathing, and then obviously Momentum, full Tondo, and then instead of actually going for Refreshing Strikes and On Guard, because I'm running Putrid Fishbone, and we're running with Keenly Jagged and Enchanted instead of like Vicious and other damage perks, I actually wanted to experiment with Light Edge, and I actually feel like we get probably more DPS with this setup. Enchanted plus Unerring plus Light Edge provides consistent damage to the rapier. So you might not see as high of numbers as you might on another build, for example, but we are getting consistent damage all the time with our rapier. And then on top of that, we have a pretty much almost 99% uptime on bleeds in general, because of the Tondo that we can stack, because of the bleeds that we can stack from our greatsword by just heavy attacking or using some of our abilities, and then also those rune glass gems like I mentioned. So that was kind of the idea regarding the bleed on this build, is to try and keep up just some form of dot on the opponent the entire time throughout the fight, and we'll kind of see what that looks like in some of the commentary, but it provides a really, really steady amount of pressure on opponents, which actually does a lot more than you would think. But that is the rapier setup. And then as far as the greatsword tree looks like or is concerned, I wanted to, as I mentioned, go for guard point, but I still wanted to pick up Unrelenting Onslaught just because of how powerful this passive is, and we are not really going for a lifesteal build. So we can only fit 8 points on this side here, or 9 points, excuse me. So 1 point into Calamity Counter, we're still running Wary Posture. I didn't grab Perfect Vigilance because we're really not going to be at full health that often, especially when we're fighting outnumbered or in an arena or stuff like that. And then on top of that, it has a 20-second cooldown. So I feel like Wary Posture is a much more consistent and higher uptime defensive passive to get. Obviously, Unflinching Blade to get that grit and bleeding. Still running Arrow Deflection for that 100% of the range damage reduction or blocking. And then Faultless Defender, because this is one of the strongest perks on the defensive side of the tree. And then obviously all of Steadfast. And then taking a look at the Onslaught side, because we are running a slightly different playstyle with our Greatsword now, to where we're sitting in guard point a little bit longer than we used to and not really being in offensive stance as often. We're almost rarely, if ever, going to be casting or using Relentless Rush from onslaught stance. 9 times out of 10, you will be using Relentless Rush from Defiant stance or from a neutral stance. Because we're not running aggressive shift anymore, because I want to stay in guard point, you will very, very rarely even be in offensive stance to get this perk to work. So I wanted to switch this out for Relentless Refresh, and then every other passive minus aggressive shift, so that we can get that unrelenting onslaught. But yeah, rambling aside, that is where the build is at. I know it might be a little bit hard to kind of picture what the build feels like now. So let's take a look at some of those PvP commentaries to actually show you guys how strong this build is now. Easily one of the hardest builds to explain on paper, but I think you'll get a much better idea of it once you start to see it in action. But 1v1 here against a bruiser, and definitely one of the builds I wanted to make this for to be able to fight against was pretty much any strength bruiser build, because that's one of the things that Great Sword allows us to do is stand our ground and fight. But we are already into the little 1v1 here. We kind of are not really running and just standing our ground, as I mentioned. We do end up taking that knockdown there, but we get a pretty good trade off of it, and you can see what the dots are doing for us now. We're not really being super aggressive during this fight until now, but every interaction that he has with us, we are not only blocking it with some form of defensive action, whether that be an evade or a guard point, but we are also then applying a little bit of damage and then some stacking bleeds, which you can then see, which over time will allow you to open people up and find openings, because before they realize it, they're pretty much dead because they've been bleeding the entire time. But we have a build here against a light armor Warhammer Blunderbuss player, and she does manage to land the shockwave there. We dodged the first part of the Blunderbuss attack there and just pretty much iframe almost the entire portion of that combo there, even though we didn't have the guard points to allow us to block it. But we do run ourselves out of stamina, and he goes for the detonate, but we managed to check a potion, and we are trying to do a good job of applying bleeds and finding our opening here. And just like last fight, before you even realize it, you're already at a point to where we can finish you off with the Rapier, because of it's actually a strange way that this build plays out. From the opponent's point of view, it almost looks like we are not really doing much, but because we are applying tondos every so often, and with each heavy attack with the great sword, we're applying bleeds, all of that damage adds up, and we can essentially dictate the pace of the fight for ourselves and pull out some pretty ridiculous situations where we can pretty much not ever have to run away from fights, which has been really fun on the build. Even when you're fighting outnumbered, the same principle applies. People really never realize how much damage we've done to them until it's too late and we finish them off for a kill. We are on a back point here, and we've jumped into a little bit of a fight with 3v1, but we've applied bleeds on everybody here with the guard points and the roll. You see, we negate so much of that damage, and before the player could even realize, we had him dead to rights, and we're able to finish off the kill there with the Relentless Rush. We do end up getting some help here from a friendly musket player, but all three of these players, as soon as we hit that combo with the guard point into the steadfast strike, it was pretty much lights out for all of them, because they had used all of their cooldowns and were pretty much bleeding and at a point to where we could finish them off. So it's a very powerful build. Even against everybody's favorite mage setup, the flamethrower build, we are able to pretty hard counter flamethrower as well, because we can block flamethrower damage while charging up a heavy, which pretty much almost fully negates the ability. This was at a point before I switched my health, or put those 50 points from strength into con. So you can kind of see what I mean now by not really having much room to make a mistake before we're forced to retreat because of the health and the mitigation differences. But even with us not having 200 con in this fight, you can see how hard it is for the mage for us to just sit there and flamethrower us. If he gets up close, we can stagger or put ourselves into defensive stance, and then just sit there and wail away at him. He's doing a pretty good job of keeping his distance right now, as he is realizing that we are able to counter flamethrower, but we are able to force out the burnout right there. And then I try to go for a steadfast right after, but just take a look at this. We literally take a single tick of that flamethrower right there and pretty much get the mage down to the point where we can finish off the kill and chase him down. It's actually such an incredibly powerful tool to use. And like I mentioned, it isn't something that you can just throw on and then start to have success, because it is something that you are going to need to be to have some practice with. But yeah, it is a very, very strong counter to a lot of things in the game. I don't want to show you just a bunch of full arena matches, because I think we're already getting like close to half an hour on the video, but just taking a look at a couple of situations that on any other light setup you're forced to run just because of how obnoxious melee is now. You can stand your ground and turn those situations into offensive victory for yourself. We have a little arena here against some full team of bruisers, I believe, but we're trying to put some work in and open up one of the tankier players with the sword and shield, but they're all going to end up switching their attention to me here in a second. We get pretty low off of the second part of that sweep there, but we were able to calamity all three while stuck in the corner there, get a disgusting double kill off of that knockdown, and like during all of this we're just chilling at 8-9k health. Like it's actually ridiculous the amount of mitigation that we are actually able to sustain or achieve now. 200 con plus the shrinking fort and the great sword buffs actually make a noticeable difference. But taking a look at the next clip here, we're trying to play the healer hunter, and we all know how obnoxious it is to have a hammer on your tail while trying to get rid of the healer. But taking a look at this fight right away, we jump into a I try to go for a little cheeky backwards evade into the healer there. But we do manage to avoid the parry, and we're able to put in quite a decent amount of pressure. We almost finished off the healer there in that little exchange, but we're unable to find the kill there. But all the while with this Great Axe, Great Hammer, or Warhammer player on us, excuse me, we do actually take the stun early, so we do hit the parry to the face. But with this Great Hammer, or Warhammer, excuse me, player on me the entire time, we're pretty much just ignoring him while going for the healer, which on 150 con light setups with no shrinking fort really isn't an option nowadays with how PvP is feeling. So I'm really, really happy with where the build turned out defense wise. While I was wrapping the build up, we actually ran into the homie Lord Sandal a couple of times in the arena, and we always just have the most fun fights for whatever reason whenever we run into each other. So I'm going to leave you guys with one of the more exciting fights that we had that night, and we'll let the fight play out for that. But if you guys have any questions at all, please let me know, as always, in the comments. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.